Certainly there's no doubt that this is the most serious crisis in the process of European integration since the middle of the last century. I think if we go back to the various times, there have been real problems in Europe. The failure of the European defence community in the 1950s, well, you know, what doesn't happen is it's difficult to call that a crisis. The empty chair crisis in the 1960s certainly was problematic. The Iraq crisis, the only one I kind of remember directly, did really have a sense of crisis about it at the time. I'd never heard the sort of briefing that went on at the time among the member states. The level of animosity at that time was something that I had certainly never heard before. I suppose the only equivalent crisis was the breakup of the ERM in the early 1990s. Big difference between that and now is that the exit costs were very, very different. That once you have your own currency, an exchange rate mechanism can break up and everybody goes back to their own currency. So I suppose that is a good starting point to look at what can happen here. And, you know, be very honest, I really don't know what can happen. I think the range of outcomes are big, and it's quite unprecedented. There's, you know, enormous amount of things have happened and are happening, and it's an extremely worrying time. But maybe to start, in terms of just giving a range of the worst case scenario and the best case scenario. The best case scenario is that the package of measures that are being implemented in the weaker member states will work. Those states will be able to, over time, with the breathing space they have, dig themselves out of the extreme difficulties they're in. At the same time, they'll introduce sort of reforms that they need. Sweeping reforms across a huge number of areas in Greece, a country like Spain that is a very dualistic labour market and needs to change it's the way its labour market functions, that a crisis will bring about the impetus for reform that wouldn't normally come about in better times. And Spain, again, would be a perfect example of a country that has gone through a long period, that things looked good, and successive governments never remotely considered tackling the labour market issue in Spain. So it could be that this crisis generates a momentum behind real reform and that things change. They change in the countries that need change, and they also change in terms of the architecture of the euro, which has clearly failed, particularly the failure of the Stability and Growth Pact, and in its place a new foundation is put under the structure that makes it more durable over the longer term. That will, even in that best case scenario, it's very clear that there will be very, very tough times for countries, and the economies are going to go through, particularly the weaker economies, the peripheral economies that haven't already gone through a degree of adjustment this country has, but countries like Greece and Portugal and Spain are now set to go through very difficult times, and that they create their own risks. I'd like to talk about that in a little further later on. So that's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is that the euro falls apart. Now, when we just don't know what would happen in that case. The idea that countries are, you know, how does it actually happen that countries sharing a currency go back to some other arrangement? And it's just pretty much inconceivable to see how that would happen without a complete meltdown of the banking system. Now, how does a modern economy that depends on banks much more than in the past, when economies were more dependent on cash, how does a modern economy function without a payment system? And we're not even talking about difficulty in adequate credit. We're talking about simply not having a payment system, the banks not being open. You know, what sort of crisis does that cause? And there seems to be no way that you could break the system up without having that kind of banking crisis in many, if not most countries, possibly all countries involved. So the worst case scenario is that can't be prevented, and the situation gets so bad that the euro breaks up, and there are those consequences as well as others that are probably unforeseeable now. So it's a nightmarish kind of scenario, and the response of European leaders 15 days ago was enormous, and it recognized quite how big the dangers were. So as I say, I think it's impossible to say or to predict where within those range of best and worst case scenarios everything will end up. But I sort of thought I'd structure this by looking at the reasons to be hopeful and then the reasons to be concerned. Thankfully, there are 5 reasons that I can identify to be hopeful and 4 to be concerned, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the balance is towards hope. It just means there seems to be closer to, maybe I'm clutching at straws and hoping that there are more good reasons. So let's start with a good reason. One is that the real economy in the world and in Europe has suffered its worst crisis, as we all know, since the first half of the 20th century, a crisis caused by the financial system, failure of the financial system. And despite that, in many, many countries, there has been economies are recovering. Companies retrenched at the time of the crisis, they became leaner. In many cases, companies are now healthier. They're beginning to invest again, beginning to employ people. So the non-finance real economy across the world is, in many cases, showing remarkable resilience and continuing and showing signs of recovery. So if the real economy can pull through this and continue on its path towards recovery, then that makes everything easier. That makes the fiscal adjustments easier. That makes the political situation easier. So that one reason to hope. The second reason is the size of the bailout package introduced 15 days ago. A really amazing package of measures in terms of the commitment governments made to bailing out other countries. There's enough money there to do for Ireland, Portugal, and Spain simultaneously what was done for Greece. So if it comes to it, the money, in theory, is there to backstop those 3 countries that are now weakest. It included also measures by the European Central Bank that even the head of the Bundesbank was publicly saying would not happen just weeks before that, particularly in terms of intervention of the secondary bond market to purchase, where the central banks purchase government debt, something that is anathema to Germans and creates its own problems. But the package is so big that it certainly gives breathing space to those countries that are in a difficult position. The third reason to be hopeful is that Depression-era thinking about fiscal contraction, particularly amongst Keynesians, is that if you tighten budgetary policy at a time of weakness, that you end up putting economies into a downward tailspin. And many people believe that that was one of the policy mistakes in the 1930s, and that thinking is still very prevalent today. You heard a version of that in this country at the beginning of last year, that if tightening and adjustment was excessive, the medicine would kill the patient, something that people who were looking for either fewer cuts or wanted to spread it out over a longer period of time argued. The medicine would kill the patient. Now, there are 2 countries that have maintained exchange rates that haven't, either in the case of Latvia, have wanted to maintain its exchange rate, couldn't devalue, and Ireland, by virtue of the fact that it's in the euro, didn't have that option. Now, those 2 countries have introduced unprecedented adjustments, fiscal adjustments, without the help of an exchange rate devaluation. And what's the evidence from both of those countries at this point? Well, the evidence is that both of them look to be at or near the bottom of downturns. The Latvian experience has been even worse, considerably worse than this country, and this country has had the worst depression. It has had a depression, has had the worst contraction, both in terms of output and employment, amongst the OECD countries. So there does not appear to have been a downward spiral caused by this really serious fiscal adjustment in either of those 2 countries. Now, that's not to say that it won't happen in other countries. We're in unprecedented territory, uncharted territory, in unprecedented times and all that kind of thing. So it's difficult to know what will happen. But I think at least there are 2 countries that have shown that very serious fiscal adjustment without exchange rate flexibility can bring about desired results without sending the economy into a downward spiral. The fourth reason is the political stability side of things, and the societal side of things. Again, certainly in my organization at the time of the real eruption of the financial crisis in September, October 2008, we sat down and it was very clear at that point that there was going to be an unprecedented recession, or certainly in our lifetimes an unprecedented recession, and thought naturally went back to the 1930s, the last time we had massive contractions in output like of the magnitude we then expected, resulted in serious political instability. So, what does that mean? Does that mean that the centre will lose ground and extremists of various hues will benefit and governments' commitments to democracy will decline and there'll be an upsurge in anti-immigration and street violence, all that sort of stuff? Well, there's been remarkably little of that despite what's happened, even in countries such as the Baltics that have had a very difficult time with it. Now, the only sort of explanation that I can come up for that is that the 1930s, a huge percentage of populations were very close to subsistence levels, and that if somebody lost a job, you couldn't feed your kids, you couldn't pay the rent, you were on the street, and you had soup kitchens and tent cities and that kind of thing. Now we live in an era of mass prosperity, where people are far from that level of subsistence, and therefore big loss of income. One can still survive. It doesn't lead you to sort of desperation levels. Even if you go into personal bankruptcy, there is a welfare system to fall back on, so that it doesn't lead to desperation. And perhaps, and again, a lot of this is just purely speculative. It could be that we see within, cities burning within 6 months. So it's simply an idea to try and make sense of what hasn't happened so far, and that maybe that won't happen because of that cushion, that there isn't the kind of desperation that there may have been in the 1930s. And the fifth reason to be optimistic is the political situation in Germany. Germany is clearly the key country in Europe in terms of its size, in terms of its relative fiscal stability, clout. And without Germany's support for this, and at times it seemed to waver, although the sort of the intellectual case for intervention was at all times there from the very first time. The European, the Euro area leaders on February the 11th announced that they would effectively bail out one of the member states. It was clear that the case for intervention was understood fully in Germany. But there was an extraordinary period where the three centres of power between the Chancellery, the Finance Ministry, and the Bundesbank went through periods of disagreement, of sending out conflicting signals, of dithering. There was all sorts of power relationships going on between those three points. But the positive side is that all five political parties in Germany are in favour of this. They don't like it, they hate it, but they do understand that it's necessary. The German people are extremely hostile to this for a whole number of reasons. If one of the political parties peeled away, there is clear and big electoral gain potentially for any party that was prepared to come out and not support it. Had that happened, I think there was a real risk that the political dynamic in Germany would have changed to the point where there may have been a doubt about whether Germany would support it. But up to now, and certainly from all soundings that I've had, there doesn't appear to be a chance that any of those five parties will peel away and that Germany will remain behind the Euro project and will do whatever it has to do to support the project. So those are five reasons to be hopeful, different types of reasons. Things can work out. There are four reasons to be really concerned. One is the extreme fragility of the financial system. The financial system, as it's existed over the past few decades, has clearly failed in a quite catastrophic way, and financial systems are critical systems for economies and societies more generally, and when critical systems fail, you have very serious consequences, and we're seeing those consequences, and those consequences aren't going to go away. That's something that will take a very long time to restructure, re-regulate, redesign, to make finance safer, and it's a very complicated thing, and it's politically fraught, and there are very powerful lobby groups and interests that will oppose it and will fight it tooth and claw on at every hand's turn. But we're seeing waves of regulation in Europe at national level, in European countries, in the US, as the response, the policy response, and the realization of just how serious the crisis has been and will continue to be, the effect it will have on public finances, for example, and the risk it poses, and the risk that the bailouts that have taken place create what somebody has called a doom loop, that each time you create such, you bail out to this extent, you create a massive moral hazard problem. You risk simply having a bigger bust at another time in the future, and there's simply, it's inconceivable that the world could handle an even bigger bust than this, particularly with public finances everywhere being as weak as they are, that it's absolutely imperative that the measures that were taken to support the system that have created moral hazard, that something is done to counteract that moral hazard over a period of time, and that will involve even more regulation than has happened. And the concern is that that won't happen for the various reasons, everything from people opposing it for their own vested interests to inertia, to a lack of clarity as to what needs to be done, to the complexity of dismantling or at least making safe the financial system. Second is that the real economy is fragile, and although it has, as I say, has been resilient and shown signs everywhere of recovering, there is a risk to that, and the risk comes from another downturn in the financial system, another shock to the financial system that could derail the real economy, the non-financial economy, and there are other risks as well. China, for example, my colleagues dealing with China are increasingly concerned that it's overheated, and that now, having made up such a large part of global demand, if that is taken out of the world economy, or if it's significantly reduced, that will have a big shock. The withdrawal of stimulus, which has to happen, perhaps the economy, the real economy is weaker, and the recovery is weaker than I'm saying, and my organisation is saying, and the result will be that as that stimulus is withdrawn, in fact, we'll relapse back into a second dip. And clearly, a decline in growth makes everything more difficult. Just as a stronger economy makes everything easier to do, another recession makes everything much more difficult. Third reason to be concerned is whether European politicians will do what they feel is necessary to redesign the architecture of the euro. As you all know, the euro was based on the idea, at least one of its foundations was, that there would be no bailouts for member states that got themselves into severe budgetary problems. Well, that's out the window now, and if you remove a foundation from a structure, sooner or later it's going to fall. So there is a full recognition that something needs to change. Now, there seems to be three broad things that can be done. There can be the status quo, don't do much, and then eventually things will come to a crisis again. Move towards full fiscal union. Many people have always argued that the only way that you can have a currency union is also to have fiscal union, and maybe that's right. Maybe ultimately that is right, and there is no other way of maintaining a single currency without fiscal union. But certainly the middle path seems to be that there is a big change in the way the Stability and Growth Pact works, and that it is a much more intrusive kind of constraint, so that those member states that are not running their public finances in a way that is sustainable over a long period of time are obliged to put in place the reforms that make them more sustainable. Now that involves you know, as we've seen lately, the concern that, you know, other in most countries it's clearly the parliament, that the budgetary process goes through a parliamentary process, and many countries instinctively feel that, you know, the idea that it is not ultimately the people who decide on budgets, but some foreigners is something that doesn't sit well with a great many people. But it certainly seems to me that there is no alternative. The status quo doesn't work, and the only way that you can push reforms and rebuild the sort of trust that, you know, with what happened over Greece in particular, that the only way you can do that is having a much more intrusive type of arrangement that is able, before things get out of control, to impose is the wrong word, but certainly prevent countries from doing things that are not in their own interests, as well as in the wider collective interest. It's not entirely clear to me that the governments will bite that bullet and go down that route, and if they don't, then the euro is simply not on a firm foundation, and there will be further trouble sooner or later. And the fourth reason to be concerned more widely, if I imagine most people here believe European integration has been a good thing for Europe. I certainly do. But I suppose as most people who look at the European Union know, that the support for it in many countries is often sort of a mile wide and an inch deep. It doesn't have a huge amount of legitimacy. It's not an entity that many people love, and any political entity that doesn't have that kind of legitimacy ultimately has a degree of fragility. It seems that there's no doubt that this crisis will undermine the legitimacy of the European Union. It'll certainly do so in Germany and the countries that don't like the idea of bailing out the profligate. It is certainly likely to have a damaging effect on the European Union in those countries where austerity measures are being imposed, and there's a sense that they're being imposed from outside. So over the longer term, this can only have a negative effect on the legitimacy of the EU, and that cannot be a good thing for the entity's long-term health and ultimately, I suppose, survival. So they are the sort of reasons for concern and some hope, and I think maybe at that point it would be better to sort of sit back and see if there's anything to discuss with you folks.